Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. If you missed yesterday's streaming charts episode, then you may not know why I was out of the studio last week. It was a radio episode, there was no video, or why I actually might be missing the next couple episodes of the show, and that's because I got married last week. Mara and I had our wedding in Los Angeles on Halloween. We're here for a week, and then we leave for our honeymoon. And so I think for the first time since I started this channel back in April of 2020, I'm going to be missing episodes of Charts while I'm gone, unless I get some weird free time and decide to do like a micro episode. So we won't be able to cover the Marvels here on the show in real time. That's something I'll catch up on later on in November. But we are going to talk about this past weekend in real time, and then we'll address the Marvels again at the end of the show. So let's jump into the top 10 movies at the box office this past weekend. It was an empty weekend, one of the lowest grossing weekends of the year, largely because this was the weekend that Dune 2 was supposed to come out. I was actually so excited for that. I was going to get married, and then at the end of that week, I was going to get a chance to see Dune Part 2 and review it here and talk about it here on the channel. But of course, the ongoing actor strike, the writer strike, which was resolved after many months, ended up having Dune pushed into 2024. And if this actor strike keeps going, then it's going to get pushed even further into next year. So without Dune Part 2, there wasn't a whole lot left, and that includes Five Nights at Freddy's, which had a huge drop in its second weekend, perhaps due partially because of the day and date on Peacock. But when we look at the box office top 10, Five Nights at Freddy's did stay number one with $19 million, but it took a 76.2% drop in weekend two. That is at an historic level, and we'll talk about those numbers in a few minutes. It has collected, though, $113.2 million domestically based on the budget at which it was produced. It is a big hit, but that's also a sizable drop. Taylor Swift, The Eras Tour, stays in second place in its fourth week of release, just an 11.8% drop from last weekend and a $13.6 million weekend total. It's now at $166 million, and if it can maintain what it does, and I've read that it will be held over for at least a fifth weekend, then we could see The Eras Tour break in to become one of the top 10 grossing domestic films of 2023. We'll just have to wait and see how that looks. Killers of the Flower Moon stays in third place in its third week of release, a 26.2% drop and a $6.8 million total. It has cracked the $50 million barrier domestically. Priscilla expanded into wide release and brought in just over $5 million in its second weekend. Believe it or not, this is the first time that Sofia Coppola has had a film that was released in over 1,000 theaters, period. Even Lost in Translation didn't get released in over 1,000 theaters, so a big landmark for her. In fifth place is Radical, a top 5 debut for a movie that's playing in just 419 theaters. The movie stars Eugenio Derbez, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we look at the limited release box office top 5 later in the show. At number 6 is The Exorcist Believer, which takes a 35.4% drop in its fifth week at a $2.1 million total. It's now over $63 million domestically. Right behind is Paw Patrol, the mighty movie. These three movies were kind of all stacked together at 6, 7, and 8. Paw Patrol's now made over $62 million domestically. And in eighth place, with a 60% drop from its opening weekend, is After Death at $2,002,000. It's made over $9 million domestic. This is from Angel Studios. It does not look like they're going to be replicating what they did with Sound of Freedom with After Death, although they have a new season of The Chosen that will be hitting theaters in the coming months, and that should probably do very big box office numbers. In ninth place is What Happens Later, which co-stars and was directed by Meg Ryan. David Duchovny also co-stars in the film. A $1.52 million opening weekend for that movie. And in 10th place, the movie that most people didn't even know existed, starring John Cena and Allison Brie, Freelance, takes a 40.6% drop to cling onto that last spot in the top 10, $1.23 million in weekend number 2, for a domestic total still under $5 million. It should also be noted that there was another movie that opened that was in over 1,000 theaters but did not even come close to the top 10, and that is The Marsh King's Daughter. It had some prestige. It's directed by Neil Berger. It starred Daisy Ridley and Ben Mendelsohn, but it opened in 13th place with a little under $850,000. The shooting for The Marsh King's Daughter wrapped over 2 years ago, but it lost its distributor in STX. Its release date was also moved at the last minute to avoid competition from the Eras Tour, although that doesn't really seem to have helped. And Daisy Ridley is a star that, outside of the Star Wars franchise, really hasn't been able to get much going at the box office. She was part of the ensemble for Murder on the Orient Express, but box office-wise, that's about it for her. And when you look at a lot of the cast members for those new Star Wars films, they have not yet become huge box office stars in their own right, like we saw particularly with Harrison Ford from the original Star Wars trilogy. So another box office disappointment for Daisy Ridley and The Marsh King's Daughter, opening under $1 million. Looking at the movies that dropped out of the top 10 this past weekend, after 5 weeks, Saw X is gone, as is The Creator, also after 5 weeks. And then after 2 weeks in the top 10, The Nightmare Before Christmas 30th Anniversary re-release is also gone to make room for new films. Looking at movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, The Creator leads the way. It lost 755 theaters. It has now fallen out of wide release. It's in 930 theaters. Saw X dropped 632 theaters. It's now in just over 1,500 theaters. The Nightmare Before Christmas dropped 560 theaters. That was about a fourth of its total theater count. It's still in 1,600 theaters nationwide. Dix the Musical from A24 does not look to be making that bigger expansion into wide release. It dropped 533 theaters, the vast majority of its total theater count. It's now only in about 102 theaters, and A Haunting in Venice dropped about half of its remaining theaters, 350 of them. It's now playing in 435 theaters. There were 2 films that closed this week, and when I say closed this week, that means that they reported grosses last weekend, but did not report grosses this weekend. Sometimes they'll sneak in and make a little bit more money, but for all intents and purposes, these 2 movies are no longer playing in theaters, and those 2 movies are Haunted Mansion, which was in release for 14 weeks, and Blue Beetle, which was in release for 11 weeks. When we look at the stat sheet for Haunted Mansion, we broke down all of the financials on the film back when the summer ended. The final domestic gross is right around $67.6 million. The international gross is at $49.7 million for a worldwide gross of $117.4 million off of an investment around $250 million from Disney when you include $150 million in budget and around $100 million in marketing and promotion. That puts its estimated theatrical loss, according to my calculations, at about $192.2 million, almost $200 million. And if there hadn't been so many other high-profile flops this summer, this is the movie that we would be talking about. And Disney has 2 or 3 others so far this year that are like this on the books as far as theatrical losses. The other film closing this week is Blue Beetle, which ended with a domestic gross around $72.4 million, an international gross at about $56.2 million, and a worldwide gross at $128.7 million. It has no more markets left to open in. It was in domestic release for about 11 weeks, and I estimate its theatrical loss at about $116 million, and we've never really broken down the movie, so let's look at how I got to that figure. It did not release in China, so no money coming in from a Chinese release. The investors get about 40% back from the international box office, which translates to about $22.5 million. Then we have a 60% share of domestic week 1, which is another $20 million, a 55% share of domestic week 2, which is another $8.6 million, and then a 50% share of the remainder of its theatrical run, which is only about $11.5 million. I have the movie budgeted at about $104 million. That is the reported number. Princeton advertising I have at $75 million, which is low for a movie of Blue Beetle's size, but the actor strike was ongoing, so they didn't have things like junkets, and it seems like DC didn't actually invest as much into the promotion for Blue Beetle as they do a lot of their other films, so it may be a little bit low. Even if it was lower, this movie still wouldn't have made money, but I'm putting it at $75 million. That puts a total investment of $179 million from Warner Brothers into the film. The gross revenue is $128.7 million. I estimate that the investors net about $62.9 million out of that, which means a theatrical loss right around $116 million. Even with the variability in that number, just not a good number for DC, whether it is part of the old guard, whether it's part of the new guard. And when we look at the franchise tracker for DC overall, we see that domestically, Blue Beetle was only able to beat 3 other DC films: Wonder Woman 1984, which was a hybrid day and date release back in 2020, The Suicide Squad, which was also day and date back in the summer of 2021, and then this year's Shazam! Fury of the Gods, which was just a disaster all around box office wise. Blue Beetle is there at number 11, just behind Birds of Prey and The Fantabulous Fabulous, etc. of Harley Quinn. Far below even The Flash, although there was significantly less money invested in Blue Beetle than there was in The Flash. And when we look at the franchise tracker for the DCEU by worldwide gross, Blue Beetle is the lowest grossing film in the history of the DC Extended Universe, below even Shazam! Fury of the Gods. At $128.7 million, it falls a little less than $4 million short of at least avoiding that bottom spot. It falls below Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, all of those films. So on a world stage, this was the least successful film in DCEU history. Let's take a look at what I like to call the road to recovery. So that red line is the box office weekend average of the years 2021 to 2022 after theaters reopened. The blue line is the combined weekend average of the years 2015 to 2019 pre-pandemic. And then the dotted black line is the weekend total for this year. And you can see the roller coaster ride we've been on, from down below where we've been since recovery to back above where we were even pre-pandemic. That's Taylor Swift. That's Five Nights at Freddy's. But we have no consistency, and we're basically back down to where we've been in 2021 and 2022 this past weekend, which is not a good place to be, again, because there's no inventory. Movies are getting bumped off the schedule. It's almost like a soft version of the pandemic all over again, which is the last thing that these theater chains and studios need right now. Although really at this point, it's kind of a situation of the studios making, because they are very much in control about how long these strikes go on. The highest grossing film for the 2021 to 2022 era was actually the third weekend, I believe, of Black Adam, whereas the highest grossing film of 2015 to 2019 was the opening weekend of Thor Ragnarok back in 2017. Those were much headier box office times for the movie industry, for Marvel in general, but that seems like forever ago, doesn't it? Thor Ragnarok opening? It was just 6 years ago. It's been a couple of months since we looked at the box office market share, which is basically when you take every single movie ticket that has been sold this year since January 1st, how much of that by percentage is going to each specific studio. And we last looked at this at the end of the summer, right at the beginning of September, and let's see what the changes have been. There actually haven't been a lot. This is what the chart looked like back in early September, with Universal and Disney basically the top two studios. Disney had a slight lead as far as overall market share at 24.32%, with Universal at 22.62%. Let's look at how much has changed in the last couple months, and the answer is not much, although Universal now has the highest share of tickets sold this year at 22.7%. Disney falls down to 22.52%, although again, they invested significantly more money in their film projects than Universal. Universal is having a much better year than Disney, although not an amazing year. Nobody's really having an amazing year. Paramount picked up some market share points. It's up to 14.32% of the theatrical market, almost tied with Warner Brothers, which is at 14.97%. Sony is lagging behind as far as the five major studios. They have not been overly active this year across the entire year. They're at 11.44% of all tickets sold. Then we have Amazon at about 3%, Lionsgate at 5.4%, and all other studios and distributors at 5.58%. The total box office for this year is at $7.68 billion. It's more box office than we had in 2022, but at the same time, all of the big movies for the end of the year are getting pushed off the schedule. We'll see if Wonka sticks. We'll see if Aquaman sticks. I think a lot of it depends on, will this actor strike get resolved? As I am filming this on Monday night, there have been some very pessimistic signs that have been coming out that the conclusion to the strike may not be close at hand. I hope that's wrong. Honestly, I would love to be able to sit here and do an update video before I leave for my honeymoon in a few days to tell you that the strike was resolved. It's not looking like that's the case right now, but maybe, hope springs eternal. Perhaps it will be very soon. Let's look at the top 5 films internationally. So these are all markets outside of the United States and Canada. Five Nights at Freddy's is still the top draw outside and inside the domestic market at $35.5 million. China's Last Suspect comes in second place at $17.8 million. Trolls Band Together, or Trolls 3, continues its international run ahead of its domestic opening in a few weeks. It's at $13.2 million. Then we have Killers of the Flower Moon at $11.85 million, and The Eras Tour at $11.6 million. When you combine those international grosses with our domestic grosses, you get the top 5 films worldwide, and the number 1 movie is Five Nights at Freddy's at $54.5 million. After a debut last weekend that was reported to be around $138 to $140 million. The Eras Tour is the second highest grossing film worldwide at $25.2 million, followed by Killers of the Flower Moon at $18.7 million, Last Suspect in 4th place, and Trolls Band Together in 5th place. So let's delve a little bit deeper into Five Nights at Freddy's. And the first thing that I want to do is to rewind back to last week, because I had to use the estimated number, and Five Nights at Freddy's actually came in a bit above that estimate. So I want to go over some of the records that the movie set with the official numbers so that we can sort of tie a bow on what we talked about last week. Let's look first at the highest opening weekends domestically for the month of October. Five Nights at Freddy's still ended up in 5th place, although a little higher than it was originally estimated. It fell about $200,000 short of eclipsing Venom to be the 4th highest opening movie in October history. It is in 5th place at $80.001 million. Venom is in 4th place at $80.225 million. Then we had Venom Let There Be Carnage in 3rd, the Eras Tour from earlier this year in 2nd, and then Joker at number 1 still at $96.2 million. Looking at the highest opening weekends in Blumhouse history, again, Five Nights at Freddy's maintains that number 1 spot at just over $80 million. That moves it ahead of 2018's Halloween, Us, Paranormal Activity 3, and Halloween Kills. Looking at the top video game adaptation openings, Five Nights at Freddy's remains number 2 at $80 million, behind only the Super Mario Bros. Movie, keeping in mind that that film opened on a Wednesday. That number would be much higher if it had actually opened on a Friday. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is in 3rd place, the original Sonic the Hedgehog movie is in 4th, and Pokemon Detective Pikachu is in 5th place. And then looking at the highest horror opening weekends of the decade for the 2020s, Five Nights at Freddy's is number 1 at $80 million. That puts it ahead of Halloween Kills, A Quiet Place Part 2, Scream 6, and Jordan Peele's Nope. So we go from the high highs of its opening weekend to the big drop-off for Five Nights at Freddy's. People suspected that it was going to be front-loaded for a number of reasons. It skewed very young. A lot of times, movies that skew to a younger audience, that audience gets out there as quickly as they can to see that film. It's also in the horror genre. Horror movies are often front-loaded a little bit or a lot, and yet I was still a bit surprised that Five Nights at Freddy's dropped as much as it did. I think perhaps the day and date of it all put it over the top. So let's look at the biggest drop-offs for a movie that opened in 3,000 theaters or more in history, box office history. The biggest drop-off was Friday the 13th back in 2009. It opened on Friday the 13th, but for the weekend of February 20th, 2009, it dropped 80.4%, which actually led to the franchise not moving forward. It actually had a very strong opening, but that second weekend collapse maybe put some second thoughts in people's heads, and they did not end up making another Friday the 13th film and have not to this point. In second place is Halloween Ends from last year, which dropped 80% in its second weekend on October 21st. This was another day and date film on Peacock, much like Five Nights at Freddy's. In third place is Mortal Engines for the weekend of December 21st, 2018. It dropped 76.8%. That puts it in third, just ahead of, if you want to call it that, Five Nights at Freddy's, which dropped 76.2%. Now, in fifth place would have been the Spider-Man More Fun Stuff re-release that was done a couple of years ago, but I decided to go for first run movies only, just to kind of remove an asterisk as far as like, well, that movie had already been in theaters, so these are first run movies only. That would give fifth place to 50 Shades of Grey back on February 20th of 2015, which dropped 73.9%. So the fifth biggest drop off by percentage for a movie in 3,000 or more theaters all time. But what's interesting is when you look at all of these drop offs, you can kind of caveat or explain why those drop-offs were so big. For example, Friday the 13th is a Friday the 13th movie. It opened on Friday the 13th, so it seems logical that an audience would go see it on that day. Halloween Ends, you have the day and date on Peacock. That could be a reason why the drop-off was so big. Mortal Engines, you see there, its second weekend was December 21st. That is the death zone as far as movies that go into the Christmas holiday. The Last Jedi ran into this as well. That just really looks bad as far as a second weekend because that's That's before people start going to the movies for Christmas, and usually while they're out doing other things. So that is always an inflated drop as far as the second weekend for any movie that's there in that 20th to 23rd range before Christmas. Five Nights at Freddy's, of course, has the day and date thing, and then 50 Shades of Grey. Valentine's Day weekend, again, eventized for people to go see it that opening weekend, which might explain why it had that big drop. Of course, day and date is something that is a new element when we're talking about box office, and there aren't that many movies outside of the pandemic era that we could even apply the day and date metric to. So I wanted to look at the highest grossing films that did receive some sort of streaming release on the same day as its theatrical release, sometimes for free for people that subscribe to the service, or sometimes as an additional fee for streaming subscribers. And the highest grossing film as far as day and date releases from 2020 onward is Black Widow, which made $183.6 million at the domestic box office, despite being available on Disney Plus with Premier Access the same day. Then we have Disney's Jungle Cruise at $116.9 million, also was available on Disney Plus Premier Access on the same day it debuted in theaters. It will soon be passed by Five Nights at Freddy's, which is available on Peacock the day that it debuted. And then we have two films that were on HBO Max day and date during their big Project Popcorn experiment back in 2021. Dune, which made $108.3 million domestically, despite being available on streaming. And then Godzilla vs. Kong, which inched over the $100 million mark theatrically at $100.9 million, despite being available on HBO Max. So it cannot be said that Five Nights at Freddy's was a failure financially. Just the budget point was so low, the debut was so high that this bottom dropping out doesn't really affect it that much in that sense. But I do wonder what it's going to look like when they're planning the sequel, because there will be a sequel to the film. Will they not put it on Peacock and hope that the movie stays better on that second weekend? Perhaps they will address some of the criticisms that people had, particularly non-hardcore fans of the franchise, as far as the story. Can you placate the fans and the people that don't know the lore as well? That's why they pay people like Jason Blum the big bucks and not me. But I will be very curiously watching when this sequel to Five Nights at Freddy's comes out and what the tone of that sequel will be. We've got so much more to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode's brought to you by Factor. It is the beginning of the holiday season, which means that your days are getting busier with shopping, planning, travel, and finishing up work for 2023. With all of that going on, it's time to take finding the time to prepare nutritious meals off the table with Factor. Factor is America's #1 ready-to-eat meal delivery service, and they can help you fuel up fast for breakfast, lunch, and dinner with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered right to your door. Their fresh, never-frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you have to do is heat and enjoy. Every week, you can choose from over 35 meal options to meet your dietary needs and preferences, and Factor even has lunch-to-go options with meals like grain bowls and salad toppers that don't even require a microwave. Factor also offers calorie-smart meals at 550 calories or less, protein plus meals with 30 grams of protein or more, and even add-ons like breakfast foods, cold-pressed juices, shakes, and smoothies. This month, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed food delivered to your door, ready in just 2 minutes, no prep, no mess. Head to factormeals.com/Murrell50 and use code Murrell50 to get 50% off. That's code Murrell50 at factormeals.com/Murrell50 to get 50% off. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Right now, a lot of people are watching their budgets, except for, it seems, huge wireless providers. From stadium names to thousands of retail stores, big wireless spends so big because they want you to think that they're your only option. Mint Mobile has a different idea. Instead of retail stores, Mint Mobile is online only, which translates to a whole lot of savings because wireless plans from Mint Mobile start at just $15 a month. My guess is that if you subtract $15 from your current wireless bill, that's still a bunch of money. And all of that is money that you could be saving every month with Mint Mobile. All plans come with unlimited talk and text, plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network, and you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and keep your same phone number along with your existing contacts. So while you may not be able to walk into a Mint Mobile store or get tickets to a show at Mint Mobile Arena, you will save money to spend however you want by switching to Mint Mobile. To get your new wireless plan for just $15 a month and get the plan shipped to your door for free, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Murrell. Let's look at some other weekend charts for this past weekend, and we'll start with some per theater averages. And for the second week, The Holdovers is appropriately held over at number 1. It expanded to 64 theaters, but was still able to bring the top per theater average for the weekend at $8,875 per theater. Radical comes in second place. It opened in 419 theaters, but brought in $6,344 per theaters. It is not a radical subject matter. It's a movie about a teacher at a tough school who finds a new way to get through to his students, but reviews have been strong. Audience response has also been positive, so we will see if Radical is one of those sleeper hits that continues to grow over the next few weeks, or if this was just a big pop on its opening weekend. This movie goes all the way back to the Sundance Film Festival, and it could very well find an audience if it's able to get marketed and the word spreads. In third place is Five Nights at Freddy's, which brought in just over $5,000. The theater count actually went up. It's now in 3,789 theaters. In fourth place is At the Gates, a movie about a wealthy family hiding their housekeeper and her son from immigration officials. It was playing in just one theater. And in fifth place, playing in 3 theaters, is the film All Dirt Roads Taste of Salt, a meditative, mostly dialogue-free story about a black woman in Mississippi as we track her across the years of her life. A24 picked the movie up out of Sundance. It made $4,176 per theater in each of those 3 theaters. Looking at the movies playing in limited release, so this is 1,000 theaters or fewer, Radical was number 1 in 419 theaters, bringing in $2.65 million. Then we had Anatomy of a Fall, which continues a successful run in limited release. It's now in 440 theaters and brought in just over $600,000 in its 4th weekend. The Holdovers brought in $568,000 in its 64 theaters in its 2nd weekend of release. The Persian version expanded to 480 theaters, didn't really have a great per theater average, but was able to bring in $164,000. And then in 5th place is the anime film The Tunnel to Summer, The Exit of Goodbyes, playing in 167 theaters. It brought in $76,000 total. This is an anime adaptation of the Japanese light novel, something similar to what we would call YA here in the US. Of course, all of these films and others like it are largely playing in the independent theaters that are scattered around the US and around the world. And before I went, I wanted to feature just one more. Now, if you missed any of these theaters, one of the videos that I'm programming while I'm away is a retrospective look at all of the independent theaters that I featured here on the show so far. So you can look out for that in the next couple weeks. But let's finish out this first round of spotlights with the Princeton Garden Theater, which is located literally across the street from Princeton University in Princeton, New Jersey. The Princeton Garden opened in 1920 and has changed owners across the decades. It was renovated in 2001 and again in 2014 for modernization and to reorganize the seating. And it is currently open as a nonprofit theater with a mission to promote and show independent films and to promote movies as an art form. This week at the Princeton Garden Theater, you can catch Killers of the Flower Moon and Anatomy of a Fall, in addition to other special programming like family and classic films. On the 16th of this month, they'll actually be showing one of my favorite underrated movies of all time, Ace in the Hole, starring Kirk Douglas. And coming soon, you can catch Dream Scenario, The Holdovers, Maestro, and many other films at the Princeton Garden. You can find out more, including how to buy tickets and donate, at PrincetonGardenTheater.org. And as always, if you do donate or you make your way over there to see a movie, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Let's head into the home stretch by looking at some seasonal and yearly charts, and we'll look first at the fall holiday box office. So this is all movies released after Labor Day until the end of the year. At number 1 is Taylor Swift, The Eras Tour at $166 million. Five Nights at Freddy's moves up to number 2 at $113.2 million. The Nun drops 1 spot to number 3 at $86.1 million. Then we have The Exorcist Believer and Paw Patrol clustered up right there at numbers 4 and 5. Saw X is at number 6. Killers of the Flower Moon Moon moves up to number 7, and it looks like it will soon eclipse Saw X for that number 6 spot. A Haunting in Venice drops down 1 spot to number 8. The Creator stays at number 9, and My Big Fat Greek Wedding stays at number 10. Looking at the annual domestic box office, this may well be the last week that we see Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny at number 10. It just depends on how the Eras Tour does next weekend. Right now, we have no changes from last week. Barbie's at number 1 at $636 million. Its theatrical run will be ending very soon. The Super Mario Brothers movies in second place, followed by Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Oppenheimer had a little bit of an expansion this past weekend. It didn't get a whole lot of traction, but it's getting close to that $325 million domestic mark. The Little Mermaid's in 6th place, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is in 7th, John Wick Chapter 4 is in 8th, Sound of Freedom is in 9th, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny for now is in 10th place. There's also no change on the 2023 worldwide box office. Barbie's at number 1 with $1.441 billion, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie at $1.361 billion. Oppenheimer's at $945.4 million, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and Fast X. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is in 6th place, followed by China's Full River Red and The Wandering Earth 2 in 7th and 8th place. Then we have The Little Mermaid in 9th place at $569.6 million, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 in 10th place at $567.5 million. Before we wrap things up, as always, I like to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we are going back to the year 1996, 27 years in the past, November 1st through the 3rd, which was also the 44th weekend of the year, and that saw the debut of Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. It opened to $11.1 million on its way to a $46.3 million domestic final. In second place in its 3rd weekend of release was the film Sleepers, starring Kevin Bacon, Dustin Hoffman, Jason Patric, Brad Pitt, and Robert De Niro. It dropped just 16.3% for a total at that time of $37.5 million on its way to a domestic of $53.3 million. And it's interesting because at the number 1 and the number 2 spot at the box office back in 1996, we had Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro, who are now co-starring in a top 5 film right now in Killers of the Flower Moon. So 27 years later, both gentlemen still in the box office top 5. In third place in its second weekend of release was the parody film High School High, which brought in $5 million towards a running domestic total of $12.6 million. It would eventually make over $20 million domestically. Fun fact, High School High was directed by Hart Bochner, who was also an actor who you might recognize as Ellis from Die Hard. That's right, Ellis from Die Hard directed not just High School High, but also PCU and other films. Fun fact for the day. In fourth place was the Bill Murray movie Larger Than Life, which brought in $3.77 million. This was a flop. It only made $8.3 million domestically. And this was such a movie that was emblematic of the 90s when people just thought insert an actor and insert something funny like an animal, and that makes a movie. So the pitch was probably just, what kind of movie do we want to make? And someone just said, what about Bill Murray and an elephant? Green light, go. Well, we don't see too many movies like that anymore. And in fifth place, another actor with animal film, although of a very different tone, The Ghost in the Darkness, starring Michael Douglas and Val Kilmer, in its 4th week of release, brought in $3.66 million for a total at that time of $31.7 million. It would top out around $38.6 million domestically. I've actually never seen The Ghost in the Darkness, but I've heard it's quite good. Of course, we don't like to leave those numbers where they are. We like to hit that inflation button and see what they would look like in today's dollars, just to get a bit of context. And when we hit that inflation button, we see that Romeo and Juliet debuted to an adjusted total of $21.8 million on its way to an adjusted domestic total of $90.9 million. See, kids will learn if you give them a reason to learn, and really that just means casting a couple of attractive young movie stars. In second place was Sleepers with $15.7 million. It actually broke the $100 million domestic barrier when you adjust for inflation. In third was High School High with an adjusted $9.82 million and a final domestic adjusted total of $41.7 million. Then Larger Than Life at $7.4 million and The Ghost in the Darkness at $7.18 million. It made $75.7 million adjusted for inflation. And that does it for Charts with Dan for this week. Of course, the big release this upcoming weekend is The Marvels, and there are a lot of questions around what exactly The Marvels box office performance is going to be. Many people perhaps projecting that this could be the lowest box office opening in MCU history. That record right now belongs to 2008's The Incredible Hulk, which opened at $55.4 million. Tracking has The Marvels opening ahead of that number, but there are many sources saying that looking at the pre-sales, etc., it may not actually be that high, and we could be looking at the worst Marvel opening weekend of all time. Now, we don't have any reviews just yet, and I think that that's going to play into part of the box office story for the film. I'll have mine here on the channel tomorrow when that embargo drops. But just a couple of words about the Marvels. Of course, one of the early things that I did when I was just starting this show and talking about box office was to debunk some of the myths with the first Captain Marvel movie back in 2019, which was a box office success. There's no if and but, no way to get around whether or not it was. But people were making up theories saying that people weren't really in the theaters. And I did a video back in my Screen Junkies days kind of trying to debunk all of that, which got some attention. This is a different case because it seems like the things that people were sort of trying to project on the first Captain Marvel film may actually come to pass with this one as far as being a potential box office failure. And we'll see how that pans out. I'm sure that some people will be very happy that this movie is not doing well because they've held a grudge against its star and against Disney for many, many years now. And this will be an opportunity for a lot of folks to go out there and just repeat the same things that they've been saying for literally years and actually have the satisfaction of not having to bend or distort the truth because it'll actually be the truth. I was not a fan of the first Captain Marvel movie. I gave it a bad review, but I also can't really get my head around devoting literally years of my life to hating a movie or a star or a franchise or whatever. But, some people do it and it's very lucrative for them, so that's great. But, I do kind of regret that I'm not here to sort of add my voice to the box office analysis for the film. I will say if you hear people making claims about the movie, they might be true, they might not be true. Hopefully, as you have watched Charts over the years, I've given you some tools as far as what you can actually research to figure out what the story is on a movie like this. I do think that it's probably heading towards a disappointing box office opening, especially because this is yet another reportedly $200 to $250 million Disney investment. They have to stop doing that for every single movie. And actually, I'm going to be doing one of my If I Ran videos next week about If I Ran Marvel. That's one of the things that I'm going to address. So take this as an IOU for the Marvel's box office analysis, as well as other movies that may come out while I'm gone. Again, if I have some extra time and I decide I want to do an episode, then I'm going to take some of my gear and my setup. I might do a review or two, but I'm also going to prioritize, really for the first time, more than a few days since I started this channel, relaxation and enjoying myself and taking an actual vacation. Being on YouTube requires a certain amount of constant output in order for your channel to stay alive and all of the numbers and the different things that pop up for people to keep watching you, which is why I banked a lot of stuff that's still going to come out over the next couple weeks, but I am also going to actually enjoy some time off. So thank you for watching this episode of Charts with Dan. If I don't see you again, I will see you in late November, and I promise I will have a catch up for all of the box office stories that happened between now and then. And I appreciate everybody's support and congratulations thus far with the wedding and the marriage and everything. We will be sharing more stuff when we get back about the wedding and the honeymoon because a lot of people want to know, and we're very excited about all of that and to share some of that with you because, it's just fun and we're excited about it. We want to let the world know. So thank you very much for spending part of your day here with me. Be sure to check the description below for more info about our sponsors, which is one of the reasons why I'm able to do the things that I do here on YouTube. And more importantly, until next time, stay safe and I'll see you then. Bye.